Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studio of the National Press Foundation. My name is Rachel Jones, and I'm the Director of Journalism Initiatives for NPF. We are joining day 3 of the Covering Rare Diseases Fellowship Program here. And before we get started into our programming, I'd like to thank once again our sponsor, Foundation Ipsen, for covering or supporting both years of our Journalism Fellowship Program. On this third day of conversations, we're going to start by talking about what it takes to produce accurate coverage of rare diseases. We're joined by 2 journalists from 2 different sectors. Rob Stein is the senior editor of the NPR Science Desk, and we hope later in the conversation to be joined by Elizabeth Merab. She is a senior correspondent for health and science for Nation Media Group based in Nairobi, Kenya. Rob, thank you so much for joining our conversation today.
Oh, sure, Rachel. Thank you very much for having me.
I think it's important for us as a group of journalists to hear from another journalist with extensive experience in covering science and research. And certainly from my experience working for NPR, your name came up so many different times on the science desk as someone who not only worked there 2 different stints, but also covered health and science research for the Washington Post for many years. So based on our conversation to prepare for this interview, you told me that you actually got your start in covering science and research issues in the mid-1980s. So why don't we start off your remarks by giving us some background on your journey as someone who specializes in these issues?
Oh, sure. Thanks again. So yes, I started in journalism as a general news reporter, but then I quickly moved into science journalism when I was working for United Press International in Boston, which was at that time one of the 2 major international news services, along with the Associated Press. And I was a science writer based in Boston, and focused on covering medicine. One of my main jobs there was to basically read the New England Journal of Medicine every week and try to figure out what was news. And that was in 1987, I believe, and I've been covering science ever since. And back in those days, this was in the very, very early days of genetic research, when just the discovery of a new gene, any new gene, was front page news in a lot of newspapers. There was a lot of excitement that this would open the door to all sorts of new insights and new ways to treat and understand diseases. And I've been covering it ever since for at the United Press International. Then I moved down to Washington, became the science editor for UPI. Then I became a science editor for NPR for about 4 years in the 90s. And as you said, went to the Washington Post for 16 years, where I was a science editor and then the national medical reporter, and came back to NPR about 10 years ago now as a editor and correspondent.
You should know that one of our fellows is actually working on a book about sickle cell anemia. So she was especially excited that you'd be joining us and that you'd be talking about the project that we really want you to focus on this morning. And that is your series of stories about a woman, I believe she's in Mississippi, is that correct?
That's right.
A woman in the state of Mississippi who was actually the first patient to be treated for her sickle cell anemia using CRISPR gene therapy. So please start us off there by telling us how you prepared for this and what your strategy was for communicating this issue to the public.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. This is one of the most exciting and, I have to say, gratifying projects I've ever worked on throughout my career. So it started because I was covering CRISPR, which, as most people I think know by now, is this very exciting, many people call revolutionary, new gene editing technique that allows scientists to make very precise changes in DNA much more easily and quickly and precisely than ever before. And you might remember that Jennifer Doudna recently won Nobel Prize for her role in developing CRISPR. And I've been following this field for a while and realized that it was starting to finally move out of the laboratory into the clinic, where researchers and doctors were starting to try to apply CRISPR to treat diseases, which was one of the great hopes and reasons people were so excited about CRISPR, that it might open up a whole new avenue of research that could lead to treatments, maybe even cures for a whole host of diseases. And so some of the very first studies were being planned and being started, and I decided to basically devote a big chunk of my reporting agenda to covering this shift, this trend, the exciting development in this field, and set about to try to basically, I wanted to tell this story through the individuals, the actual patients who were potentially would benefit from this and who were volunteering for these trials. So I set about basically reaching out to as many of the researchers, and in this case, there were a lot of companies, basically biotech companies, that were involved in sponsoring these trials, to try to see if I could identify the first patients to enroll in these studies. My goal was to try to follow some of these patients through the whole experience of volunteering for the trial, preparing for the trial, going through the treatment, and seeing how well it worked or not. At this point, it was all very theoretical. Nobody really knew how well it would work, whether it would work, whether it would be a gigantic failure or enormous success. And it turned out to be extremely difficult. It was one of the most challenging enterprises I ever undertook, because it's just very complicated when trials are first beginning, and especially in something like this, where it's a new technology. There's a lot of excitement, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and so there's a lot of concerns about what could go wrong. And so there's a lot of trepidation among the researchers and all the entities involved about allowing journalists access to that sort of things, especially so early on in the process. And it was also even more complicated because it involved biotech companies, where there's a lot of proprietary technology involved, and they tend to be much more, I'd say, secretive than maybe academic researchers, and much more sort of skittish about allowing journalists to get access to their research. And in this case, this particular trial, with the sickle cell trial with CRISPR, involved two separate biotech companies. So the amount of negotiation that went on to try to get access to this was just mind-boggling. I had to negotiate with two different biotech companies, the academic researchers involved, because trials were being conducted at medical centers and academic research centers around the world. And I had to basically negotiate with all of them, and they all had competing interests in this and their individual concerns. So it literally took at least a year or even more to basically get this going. And there were many times in the process where I thought I had an agreement to basically be able to follow a patient through a trial, and then it fell through for one reason or another, or people changed their minds or got too worried. But in the end, I had the great fortune of finally getting approval to follow this incredibly woman, Victoria Gray, through her experience of getting treated with CRISPR for sickle cell disease. And I have to say, I hit the jackpot with Victoria Gray. She is one of the most amazing people I've ever met. She was, I think, probably the most expressive person I've ever interviewed. She articulated to me what it's like to have sickle cell disease and what it was like to go through this very grueling process of being treated with CRISPR in a way that I really think communicated a lot of complicated stuff to people. And so I feel—
Well, I'm going to interrupt you here because I want you to share with us. So we have such an international cohort. Help us picture who Victoria Gray was or is, how old she is, where in Mississippi, and for those who may not be familiar with the state of Mississippi, give us that sort of setting so we can follow your journey.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, thanks. Yeah, so when I met her, she was I think 34 years old, and she had been diagnosed with sickle cell when she was an infant. And so she had lived her entire life, with struggling with sickle cell disease. And
An
then
African-American woman.
she's an African-American woman from a small town in Mississippi. Mississippi is a very rural, most of the state is a very rural state, and she grew up in a very small town in Mississippi. And basically sickle cell dominated her life. It really it made life very difficult for her. And I have to say that had been a medical writer for decades. Done a lot of stories about sickle cell disease, but I have to admit, and I'm embarrassed to admit, that I never really appreciated really how difficult it is to live with sickle cell disease. It really just dominates the lives of people who have it. And it is a terrible, cruel disease. It's debilitating. It often shortens people's lifespans. But she had been struggling with it in her entire life. She had been gone through a couple of different, sort of the standard treatments that worked to some degree, but not really. It had taken a toll on her physically. It had damaged her heart. It had derailed her plans to go to nursing school. It interfered with her education, her career, her personal life. For people who aren't that familiar with sickle cell disease, one of the hallmarks of the disease is that it causes these incredible episodes of pain, people that call pain crises, that are just cause this extraordinary pain that I don't think anybody who hasn't experienced it could really understand how terrible it is. It's this excruciating pain for which there's almost impossible to get relief. You can take very strong painkillers to treat it, but oftentimes that's one of the terrible problems with sickle cell disease is doctors don't appreciate how terrible it is, and it's difficult to get access to those treatments. A lot of patients are denied the treatments they need to really treat their pain. And it basically takes over people's lives. And after a lot of struggle in her life, she came across this. She was going to undergo a bone marrow transplant, which is one of the treatments for sickle cell disease if you can find a donor. But then she discovered that this trial was starting with CRISPR, and she decided to volunteer for it.
Where was the trial located in conjunction to where she lived? Did she have to travel hours? How did she find out about it? Can you give us some background on that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, as I said, the trial was sponsored by these two biotech companies that were based in the Boston area, Vertex and CRISPR Therapeutics. But the trial was being conducted at medical centers around the world, and the medical center she heard about this from is called the Sarah Cannon Research Institute in Nashville, Tennessee, which was about I think a 4 or 5 hour drive from her house in Mississippi. And so that was she heard about it from her doctor, heard about it and recommended she go talk to the lead researcher there, Dr. Frank Gould. And it required her to drive back and forth between her home in Mississippi and Nashville many, many times. It's a long drive, not an easy thing to do for somebody without a lot of resources. And she had to go back and forth many times just for the testing to make sure she was eligible for the trial. And then once she did get accepted into the trial, she had to go back and forth many times for the additional testing and the preparation for the actual treatment. It required her to spend when the trial finally started. It is essentially is a bone marrow transplant, which basically entails getting high doses of chemotherapy drugs to basically obliterate your own bone marrow, to basically make room, in this case, for the genetically modified bone marrow cells that they hoped would treat her disease. That's a very grueling, unpleasant experience to go through, which required her to be hospitalized in Nashville for a couple of months. And she ended up spending essentially the summer in this Nashville hospital. So, separated from her family. She was married. She had 4 children. She had to leave them behind in Nashville, which was very difficult for her. She's a very devoted, loving mother, which again, anybody who's had children knows how hard it is to be a parent and to try to be a parent with sickle cell disease when you're constantly having these pain crises, constantly having to rush to the hospital at any given moment. You'd end up in the ER, desperately trying to convince a doctor to give you pain medication. You're tired all the time. It's really hard to just do basic things like bathe yourself, feed yourself. But she was a loving, devoted mother, and raised, 4 beautiful children. And anyway, so that was another difficult part of this, of being separated from them for such an extended period of time. Her husband, was home taking care of the kids. Her dad came down to Nashville with her and was to be with her during this difficult time in the hospital. So I'll stop there just because, to see where you want to take the conversation.
Well, so you've painted such a vivid picture of who she was. You've given us a lot of insight into the process it took to even find her and to start thinking about reporting on her. So what I think would be valuable in this moment is for you to really break down the process you developed to how I'm going to tell this story, how much time I'm going to need to spend with her. Do I do a story outline? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my goal, which is we ended up doing, was to chronicle her experience, to basically tell the whole story of her, how she found out her life before the trial, how she found out about it, what it was like to go through it. So, and to do a series of stories, basically in real time, chronicling her experience as she went through this experience. So, as I said at the beginning, we didn't know she was the first patient to be treated with this, and the intent of the trial, really at the beginning, in her case, was really just to see if it was safe. And they had no idea whether they would be able to tell whether it would actually work, because this was a new technology that had never been attempted on a human being. There were a lot of concerns that something could go wrong. It could actually be harmful. And so the way these trials work with a technology this new is they start with they don't want to do, they want to make, minimize the chances of doing harm. So they start with the lowest dose possible, just to make sure that it's not going to do anything bad to the patient. So, going into it, she didn't know, the doctors didn't know, I didn't know what was going to happen. It could turn out to be a dud. It could do nothing. It could end up being harmful. We had no idea. So, so we started off. I met her just as she was starting the trial. She was just going through the gone through the chemotherapy part of it, and then had gotten the infusions of just to step back for a second. The way it works is they took out some of her bone marrow. They used CRISPR, the gene editing technique, to modify a single gene in her bone marrow to start producing a healthy form of a protein called hemoglobin, which sickle cell patients lack, with the idea that they would then obliterate her own bone marrow, infuse the genetically modified cells into her body. The cells would start reproducing inside of her body, repopulate her bone marrow, give her basically a new bone marrow system, and that would produce this healthy form of hemoglobin that would basically ameliorate, cure all the terrible symptoms she'd experienced all her life. So when I met her, she had just was starting to go through that, getting the chemotherapy and then getting the infusions of genetically modified cells. So when I met her, she was in the hospital. She was, felt terrible. She'd gone through this very difficult procedure. She'd been in the hospital for a while, separated from her children, and she was a very kind of vulnerable emotional state. And again, I have to say how grateful I am, how gracious she was in that condition, to be willing to let me into her hospital room, to sit next to her hospital bed, and have her recount the story of her life and this experience, and to go through this. And she did, and in the most eloquent, expressive way. And that was the first story. And then I went back and forth between my base in Washington, D.C. and Nashville, Tennessee, many times to basically to meet with her, because she finally to come back and check in to see how things were going. And I did a series of stories to chronicle as it progressed.
Our radio journalist fellow from Malawi was asking a question earlier about, how long his story should be. Should it be a feature? Should a series of features? So tell us about that process for you when you're meeting a subject and you've decided on a topic. How do you decide whether you're going to do 5 stories, one big one? Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, it varies depending on the circumstances, obviously. In this case, my hope was to basically that it would be a series of stories that would sort of drop in basically at critical moments during the trial, when she was treated, when she first, was able to be discharged from the hospital, when she started to find out whether, was working or not, and then follow her throughout. And in this case, and the length of it always depends on a variety of factors: how complicated the subject matter is, the how articulate the person being interviewed is. In this case, she was extremely articulate, and the story was very complicated. So, I ended up doing a series of stories that I think were each, about 8 minutes long, which is quite long for an NPR story these days. And these were very audio rich stories, and there's a lot of natural sound involved. I went the first couple times with a producer. We gathered a lot of audio about her getting her blood drawn, the interaction with the doctors, to create these scenes, to really take listeners into her hospital room, into the laboratory, to be experiencing this with her as she went through this process. And then at one point, after we did a series of, I think, maybe 4 or 5 stories, we actually then kind of put them together into a Christmas special, which was a 22-minute long radio special that aired on Christmas Eve, that sort of recounted the whole trajectory of her experience.
Rob, I could talk to you all day about this. So I'm going to at least make the offer to the journalists at this point. Are there any questions any of you fellows would like to ask for Rob? Hawken Miller is raising his Zoom hand. So Hawken, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Rob, for your time. And I'm really grateful to be able to talk to you. So I am a fellow, obviously, with the National Press Foundation. I work for a company called BioNews, writing about different rare diseases. I myself have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, so this issue is kind of a personal one for me. But my question, I kind of have 2 for you, if that's okay. The first one was, we often hear about this is the first person to be treated for this and that, and I'm curious. I'm always hesitant with things like that, because how do you verify something like that? And I don't want to say something that is, the first person, then be wrong. So my first question is, how are you able to verify that she was the first person treated in the US with CRISPR?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it is one of those things where you're always like, well, am I sure? Am I missing somebody? In this case, it was a very new technology, so it was still a very, very small sort of universe of people who had the capabilities or to do this sort of research. And so I did spend a fair amount of time, doing a lot of preliminary research to try to identify all the players, who were involved in this, to make sure that I wasn't missing something. And it is possible that there was somebody someplace doing something secretly that nobody knew about, but I felt fairly confident after doing a lot of background reporting, that that wasn't the case. There were a limited number, of people who could do this and would be able to do it, especially in the United States. They would have to get approval from the Food and Drug Administration to even start a trial like this. And so I knew for sure that in the US there was nothing else going on that I didn't know about, unless they were doing it illegally.
Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about, getting such good access, and you talked about, part of that was reaching out to all these coordinators for these, clinical trials and such. Did you have to do any convincing for Victoria to be open, or was she pretty much on board from the beginning?
Yeah. she was on board from the beginning. I mean, I basically found out about her through, in the end, it was through the companies that were sponsoring the trials, and they basically, asked her if she was interested and okay with doing this, and and I and she was. I had separately done my own. I had also reached out to like some of the sickle cell patient support groups too, because they were also involved in trying to recruit patients for this, and I had spoken to a bunch of people there, but in the end, it was the companies that really knew who was involved, and so they basically found her for me.
Shiraz from Pakistan.
Yeah.
There you go.
I have a question, like, because you are covering the rare disease, so how do you convince the families for the coverage, and while covering their beloved one who are like facing that rare disease? Because when some of the families who came over here and just experienced their interaction with the journalists, particularly, they had some serious objections on some of the headlines and some of the content which the journalists have produced while covering those events. So how, what's your methodology, and how do you convince the families for this?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question, and it's important because when we're talking to people in these situations, they're in a very vulnerable place, right? I mean, they're sick, they're not feeling well. They're also very anxious to be better, and so to get access to the treatment they're trying to get access to. So we are very conscious of the fact that we want to make sure that people are okay with what we're doing, that they are comfortable with participating in this, and in no way do they feel like obligated to do it or any pressure to do it, and they only are doing it because they want to. So I personally go out of my way to give people every opportunity to say no, basically. No, this is not what how I want to spend my time right now. I want to be spending more with my family, or I need to be focusing on my own health right now. And so I just spend a lot of time ahead of, in the beginning, talking to the patients and their families to make sure that they are fully comfortable with this, and that and explaining to them that if there's any point at which they do not feel comfortable, or there's things, that we capture, because we are like literally in their hospital rooms, they're in their hospital gowns, and if there's anything that they're not comfortable with including in it, it's something we talk about, because the last thing I would want to do in a situation like this is to make their lives any harder than they already are, because they're already in a very difficult place.
Fellow Bijal Trivedi of National Geographic actually asked, how did you negotiate with the biotech and pharma companies? Hold on, the question just slipped on me. Okay, she said, I had to sign a bunch of legal docs when dealing with Vertex for her book. Did they ask to review your story? And where did you start, with the companies or with Victoria's physician?
In this case, I started with the companies. I mean, I also, at the same time, was reaching out to individual researchers. I knew where the clinical sites were, so I had reached out to like the principal investigator in Colombia, and I had been talking separately with, because there was a chance they might be the first site to treat a patient. But yeah. That, as you know, that dealing with the biotech companies is very difficult. But no, we did not have, they did not have, they did not review our stories before they aired at all. The only thing we agreed to, which was a little unusual, was basically we held our stories, at least the beginning, the first couple, until we coordinated with the companies when we would air the first stories, and it turned out to be basically we held it until they were ready to report the first data from the trial. which was fine by us because we wanted to wait for that. We wanted to, to have some substance to report in addition to the personal stories. So that's how we ended up timing at least a couple of stories to when they were going to report the results at I think it was the first one. I think the first couple was at like the scientific meetings, hematology meetings. So that was the only restraint on the reporting. Yeah, except I mean, we did also. I didn't at least initially didn't have any really contact with Victoria directly. I went through her doctor and the companies initially. And that again was to protect her privacy and I'm trying to think, is there any other restrictions? Oh, the only other, yeah, that was it. I mean, the other restrictions, we didn't share any of her contact information with anybody else. Again, that was to protect her privacy. She did not want to really be, barraged by interview requests and that sort of thing.
Journalist Portia Gabor from Ghana has the next question. Portia?
Hi, Rob. I'm interested in finding out how you were able to break down the medical terms to make even a 1-year-old understand Victoria's story. Thank you.
Yeah, that is tough, especially with a subject as complicated. And we're talking about, genetic engineering, genetic modification, and the condition itself is, sickle cell. It's not that easy to explain. But again, I was very fortunate. I mean, Dr. Frank Gould, who was Victoria's doctor, was very articulate, very good at explaining, fetal hemoglobin and fetal hemoglobin, and basically how the disease works and how the technology worked, and so that is half the battle, as anybody who's covered this stuff knows, is getting articulate scientists who can help you explain this stuff.
Since you mentioned that, I have seen several times through the years descriptions of sickle cell or the pain that it causes by saying, imagine a loop trying to get through a thin tunnel and whatever. So I want you to talk a little bit more about ways that a journalist can describe a complicated scientific process or impact on a family in a way that doesn't dumb it down too much and won't make the scientists mad and never want to talk to you again. But are there ways that you can do that?
Yeah, that is the challenge in science journalism generally is exactly how you articulated it very well, that you want to be able to explain it in a way that the average person can understand, but it's still scientifically accurate, and representing it, clearly, but precisely. I do not have a science background. I went to college for journalism. I am not a scientist. I am a journalist, and so which is a detriment, but also I think an advantage in some ways, because I have to understand it, right? And if I can understand it, then it helps me explain it. And I want to be able to, so oftentimes I will, that said, I've been doing this for so long that I do, like a lot of scientists, who tend to lapse into jargon and stuff like that, and I have to catch myself to make sure that I'm not using terms that aren't accessible to most people. So a lot of times after when I've written something to try to explain something, I will try it out on my wife or my kid or my neighbor to see if it's working for them, and that's sort of the way I check myself.
Namat from Lebanon has a question.
Hello, this is Namat Kredli from Lebanon. Thank you for the workshop first. I want to ask about secret investigations. Did you use any secret investigations like undercover journalists to follow up with the medical process, the legal procedures? Thank you.
No, I wouldn't say I used any secretive things. I did do a fair amount of outside vetting, because I wanted to make sure that I talked to a lot of researchers in the field who were not directly involved in this trial, to see what they thought about it, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't giving this particular trial undue attention. And so I did a lot of background reporting with, experts in genetics, in CRISPR. I talked to Jennifer Doudna, who helped develop it. I talked to folks at the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, who was the director of the National Institutes of Health, and very, very well known, famous geneticist himself. I spent a lot of time talking to bioethicists, because a trial like this does raise a lot of bioethical issues. You're trying something that has never been tried in a human being before, and are you getting adequate informed consent? Do the patients really know what they're getting into? So I was very conscious of that, and actually spent a fair amount of time in some of the stories, walking through that, because there were some ethical concerns actually about this trial. The National Institutes of Health had eliminated a layer of ethical review that it had subjected most genetic studies to before this trial came up. And so it had gotten somewhat less oversight. And there were some researchers and bioethicists were concerned about that. So I included that in my reporting.
Helen Shikanda of Kenya, is your microphone working? I'm going to read her question because she also dropped it into the channel. She asks, she wrote a story about a man who had a rare disease called trimethylaminuria, if I'm reading that correctly. The headline to the story in the Daily Nation, I believe it was a man who smells like fish. While some people were enlightened, others were not kind to him. And he read those comments. He reached out to her and he was very sad. I think this is a very important topic for you to talk with us about, Rob, because oftentimes the sort of generosity of people who are struggling with these issues and decide or agree to talk to us because they hope it'll help somebody else even, it's a important obligation for us. But then if it backfires, how do you handle with that?
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And that was something I was, concerned with a lot with Victoria, again, because the last thing I wanted to do, she's such a wonderful person and had such a difficult time with sickle cell. The last thing I wanted to do anything that would make her life any harder. And, I checked in with her regularly to see how things were going in that regard. Because, once your name is out there in the world, people, you never know what's going to happen. And, she, for the most part, it was a very positive experience for her. She was very happy she had participated in the project and felt very grateful for it. That said, she did get some, she had gotten some, heard some things from the public, especially at one point I interviewed her. It was the summer of the George Floyd protests in the United States. And this was, for folks internationally don't know about it, there was a man who was killed by police, and there were a lot of protests in the streets about it. And that was going on as Victoria was recovering from her procedure. And so, I talked to her about it, and she was very articulate in expressing, how that affected her and her kids, while she was recovering from this grueling experience. And, that she did get some blowback from the public, from people in her church even, about some of the things she said about that, the rioting she was upset about. And that was hard for her, and I felt bad about that. But all of that said, she was still not, didn't regret having said what she said, didn't regret that it was included in the stories. It was a hard thing for her, but she was still glad she did it. So I was glad to hear that. And I just did one more thing I should add about that. And I have to say, I'm grateful to work at a place like NPR, which is super conscious and careful about this, and really cares about people, and goes the extra mile to make sure we're not exploiting people in any kind of way.
I have to tell you, Rob, I often tell people that NPR was probably, is quite literally the best newsroom environment I ever worked in, because on the science desk, they challenged you on every different levels. Why are you doing the story? How are you going to do it? And there were so many people there who offered input and insight into how to proceed.
Yeah.
It really changed me as a journalist. But Hawken Miller also brings up a very important point. He says, and he wanted to offer this insight to Helen, the headline to that story probably created half of the problem. And I've had this happen to me as a print journalist, primarily through my career, where if you have an off-putting headline, it can sort of totally either derail the story, cause some people to not want to read it, or have them off on the wrong foot. So that's not an easily solved problem, because in a newsroom, the journalist often has nothing to do with the layout and what the headline is, but it's certainly a conversation that journalists need to have, and they need to raise that awareness in the newsroom setting. I have to make a note of the fact that we got a response from Shruti Mitkas, who is a director of genetic education in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she is offering to support any of our fellows when it comes to translating and understanding these terms, or whatever. So I'm about to connect with her on LinkedIn and thank her for that offer. And I think, once again, we journalists need to be able to reach out to scientists who are willing to work with us. So Hawken, did you have one more question also that you wanted to ask?
I did, yeah. I just wanted to ask you, Rob, kind of, you did the story and the process of doing it, and then just kind of the impact, post publishing the story. I was curious if you know if there have been other patients treated now, how many patients have been treated, and if this has changed any of, the development of CRISPR or garnered interest from other companies to pursue this.
Oh, yeah. So in this particular trial, I think they've lost track a little bit, but I think they've treated a total of 40 something patients, and that's patients with both sickle cell disease and a related condition known as beta thalassemia. And this is internationally, and it's all gone quite well. I mean, it hasn't worked for everybody, but it's helped most of them, and the companies are planning to submit to the Food and Drug Administration sometime next year for to try to get approval to start to actually make the treatment available more widely outside of the clinical trial. And there are now, since that trial started, there are several other trials that have started to, actually treating patients using CRISPR for other conditions. There's a company called Editas in Boston as well, that's using it to treat a congenital form of blindness. It's restoring vision to people who could not see. It's so far producing some promising results. There's another condition, I forget the name of the company, but it's treating a form of amyloidosis, which creates a deformed protein that damages organs, that is also showing promise. So yeah, I mean, things so far so good with CRISPR, and there's been no dangerous side effects of any kind that have arisen. So fingers crossed.
Fellow Diana Chiangwa of South Africa asked one more question, and I think this is going to offer an opportunity for collaboration between fellows. Diana, is your microphone working now? So if in case it's not, her question is, the story that I'm doing is about a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and the mother uses the word "we" when referring to her son because she's part of the journey. So Diana asks, as a journalist, how do I apply this approach when she's documenting the story? Should she use her mother's way of describing the connection, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, it's that, doing stories that involve minors is very tricky situation, as you know, because you cannot get consent from a child, they're not old enough to give consent, to understand, enough to basically give consent. So you have to basically get consent from their parents, and you do have to, be very careful that the parents are, acting in the best interests of their children by providing consent to let them participate. And so again, at NPR, we have extra layers of to go through before we can do stories where we have the voices of minors on the air. But that said, once we're comfortable with that the consent is, okay, and it's in the best interest of the child, then sure. I mean, it's, the parents, this their kid, right? So they should be able to express themselves however they want, as long as it's, somehow not damaging to the child. And that sounds like to me, sounds kind of a sweet attitude that the mom feels so connected to her child that, she talks about that way.
We got about 10 more minutes, and so we want to make sure that we wrap this up, but get the most out of having you here with us. Someone named Onur Gakir has raised a hand. Can we connect with Onur? Okay, as we get that sorted, Rob, I'd like you to sort of wrap us up by saying what are the stories. I believe I asked you to think about some story ideas that journalists could pursue. What are some recommendations that you would make? And keep in mind that we have journalists from a broad range of settings, so from the US to Zimbabwe. You had some time to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the context of this, what we've been talking about, I mean, the big question now becomes if these therapies are actually working, and can actually help people. As we know, sickle cell disease, it's most common in countries with fewer resources, and these are extremely expensive procedures to do. I mean, they're out of the reach for many people in the United States, and so the big question becomes now, with these new genetic technologies, some of these genetic treatments cost millions of dollars, which is it's out of the reach for a lot of places. And so the big question, I think that's important, prospecting for journalists, is to how are we going to translate this stuff? How are we going to give access to these very exciting new therapies and technologies to people who need them most? It's something that I know that National Institutes of Health, because of some of the progress that we've been reporting, they've started to basically fund pilot projects to address just that, to try to make them more affordable. But I think it'll be really important as journalists to stay on top of that, and to especially because there's a lot of money involved in this. As I said, a lot of this research is being funded by biotech companies, by private companies who want to make a lot of money, and they are making a lot of money. And so I think it's our duty as journalists is to hold their feet to the fire and say, okay, you guys, it's working. That's great. That's very exciting. You're making a lot of money, but how are you going to make this available to the rest of the world, to the people who need it the most?
One of the tactics that I recommended as well is trying to quantify the impact of rare disease and show a setting of what our country or what our region misses out on when we don't invest in gene therapy, et cetera. That can be kind of tricky, I know, but what advice would you give to, say, a journalist in Kenya who wants to write about the fact that there are no genetic counselors or there is no hospital that offers this? Would you advise them doing what I suggested, which is trying to extrapolate, the impact, the cost of the impact, how many families might have it, how much that would cost, and comparing it to another expenditure?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think you have to you have to report about this in the context of the culture in which you're talking about it, and try to figure out how to make it relevant to the people, your listener, your readership, obviously, because And you know, and that's important. And I think it obviously varies from country to country and culture to culture, in terms of how much resources they have. Sort of, you know, what are the other competing problems, you know, that are competing for the resources, you know, for this. I think that is very helpful. I mean, and very important, because you have to have that context to make sure that you're accurately representing the scale of the problem and the kind of resources that you would want to devote to solving that problem.
Rob, I'm going to give you a break because I think I see the fabulous Elizabeth Merab has joined us. Elizabeth, are you there?
Hi, Rachel. Yes, I'm here. Unfortunately, my video, I cannot turn on my video because I'm just clearing at the hospital.
My dear, we see your beautiful face, and that's all we need to see. So what I want to first say before you speak is that we would love to try to have a session with you. We're going to try to reconvene everyone in a month or two. So we're going to ask you to come back and speak to the journalists at length at that point. But for right now, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background as a health and science reporter and your personal story.
I am a health and science journalist working for Nation Media Group. This has been my 7th year reporting on health and science. I usually am very specific that I cover health and science, not just health. And the reason being that health is divided into medicine, and science covers research. At least I see it that way. So what I do is I cover all the aspects of medicine, and then I cover research, drug and vaccine development. So my experience as a journalist has been that of gaining both experiential experience and professional experience through training, so that I can back up my experience with training. Therefore, it makes sense for me when I talk to doctors, when I talk to researchers, I'm able to reason with them, and I'm able to communicate what they are saying. And I'm also able to reason and understand patients. And what I do mostly whenever I cover my stories, I really try to be empathetic to the situations that people go through. And I found that to work very well for me, because when you understand people, when you understand and appreciate the processes and the struggles and the challenges they go through, you're able to communicate better. And my personal story, I think, has also contributed a great deal on how I cover my stories. I'm very deliberate on the type of stories I cover. Mostly, I do new medicine. And by that, I mean things like gene therapy, things like new cures for diseases that have always never had a cure, like sickle cell disease, like fibromyalgia, though right now things like fibromyalgia are really managed. But you see, at this point in time, we are talking about a cure for diseases like sickle cell, diseases like HIV that never had cures before. So for me as a journalist, I do live with sickle cell disease and chronic pain. And as I'm communicating with you right now, I'm trying to clear, I had been admitted on Monday, and I'm trying to clear out from hospital so that I can go back to work. But that experience that I go through these challenges personally make me want to tell stories of patients who go through the same ordeals. I tell them compassionately. I really use compassion and empathy to tell my stories. So I find that to be very relatable with people. I also talk to professionals and try to understand the jargon before I communicate it. So that has been my experience for the last 7 years. And if I was to talk to young journalists to follow in my footsteps, I'd tell them to always be compassionate about when they're covering stories. Always be empathetic, not sympathetic to the situation, because empathy is very different from sympathy. I don't know if I've answered all your questions.
Elizabeth, you could not have done a better job of introducing yourself, of encapsulating the role of a journalist in communicating these issues. I only wish we had another hour to give you to talk about this, but this is why I'm going to enlist your support when we do have another discussion about this with the fellows. But I want to thank you again for attempting to join us, particularly with what you've gone through recently. I'm sure the journalists will want to reach out to you perhaps even before we can all gather. But between hearing from Rob Stein, senior editor of National Public Radio, and you, I really feel that our journalists have a strengthened grasp on the impact or potential of gene therapy treatment for this particular disease. And we're so grateful to both of you for taking the time out to reach with us, and we will be in touch with you both moving forward. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Rachel. I'm happy to talk to the journalists and share my experience anytime.
And Rob, again, as I told you before we started, you're probably going to get more emails than you can handle, and I'll be included in that group. But we so appreciate you sharing the journey of the first sickle cell patient treated with CRISPR disease.
Well, I look forward to the emails, and thank you so much for including me. It's been a pleasure. It's been really fun.
Okay, great. Take care.
Bye-bye.